The Chinese Exclusion Act was a monumental event that greatly impacted the social climate in America during the 19th century. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the halting of Chinese immigration to the United States. However, this not only impacted Chinese immigrants traveling to America, but also the immigrants who had arrived in America previously. This was the first time in American history where an immigration law was ratified which targeted a specific party or race of individuals. While passed by Congress as an immigration restriction, the Chinese Exclusion Act was a racial restriction law that established a negative precedent for future immigration legislation.
Chinese immigrants began pouring into America during the 1850s. They were looking to escape the poverty and unrest that was prevalent in China during this time due to the First Opium War that occurred through 1839 through 1842 under the rule of the Qing dynasty. In addition to the California Gold Rush of 1849, Chinese immigrants were swarming to the west of America for the opportunities it had to offer. These opportunities included the mining and railroad companies, which were industries that were thriving from the expansion and especially appreciated the Chinese immigrants looking for work. The companies welcomed the immigrant labor since the Chinese workers were seen as inexpensive and were willing to work in horrible conditions for the little pay they made. Within 30 years, 200,000 Chinese had come to the West, making up 8.6% of California's population and 25% of its labor force. Because the Chinese made up a quarter of the labor force in the West, they faced heavy discrimination from the American workers since they were taking their jobs in communities where unemployment could be as high as 25 to 30%. The immigrants were also made out as scapegoats for economic instability that was surrounding the Western settlers at the time. The Chinese, who were facing discrimination from the communities and inhuman work conditions from the railroad and mining companies, soon realized their strength in numbers. However, the cards were stacked against them. In 1867, around 5,000 Chinese railroad workers went on strike for greater pay and less hours. The railroad company retaliated at the Chinese laborers by cutting off their food supply, forcing the starving workers to return to the railroad a week later. Many other companies, especially the railroads, soon oppressed the immigrants who began forming unions, hoping to extinguish the cry for rebellion that was looming. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough.
It was the justification, part of it was cultural, these yellow-skinned people who brought their strange language and strange religion and strange culture and their opium habits and so forth to the United States were simply, they were alien and they were foreigners and they were not like us, quote unquote us, the people who were already here. And the fear was that they would somehow contaminate, Protestant American culture. But the big reason was that they worked for much lower wages than laborers, regular unionized laborers worked. And so it was easy and convenient to exclude them. For one, they did not have any political voice anywhere. They were not allowed to vote in most places, and so they were easy, marginal targets. Now, also, they were becoming targets increasingly of violence perpetrated against them by working class men in a lot of the far-flung places in the West. There was a notorious riot, an anti-Chinese riot that occurred in Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885. And about 26 Chinese were killed in that riot. The railroad cut wages, and instead of the working class men turning their anger against the railroads, they turned it against the Chinese in the camp down at Rock Springs, and just a melee ensued, and it was a full-scale riot. And by the end, 26 Chinese are dead, and nobody was ever brought to justice.
American workers began to petition for a Chinese expulsion movement that the government wouldn't be able to ignore. Due to the unrest occurring in the West because of the Chinese immigrants, Congress passed the first law in American history restricting the number of individuals who were not only entering the United States, but also based on their nationality. The Chinese Exclusion Act was ratified May 6, 1882, that was to be enforced immediately. The act not only affected Chinese entering the United States, but those who had already emigrated here. The Chinese who were immigrating here needed to obtain certification from the Chinese government that assured the individual who wished to emigrate to America was qualified to do so on account of if they were not a laborer. The American government was more willing to allow individuals who were fit enough to be laborers for the railroads or the mines to enter the country, so it could be a challenge proving one was able or not able enough to work in such conditions. This caused many to be denied the action of entering America, forcing them to return to China, where the country was in a precarious place at the time. Moreover, the Chinese who were already in the United States had limitations placed on them as well. If one was to leave the United States, they had to obtain new certification to enter the country. In addition, Congress wouldn't allow federal or state courts the allocation of citizenships to Chinese aliens. With all of these restrictions placed on the Chinese, the act also stated that the government could deport any Chinese immigrant for little to no explanation at their leisure.
The Chinese Exclusion Act was to last only 10 years. However, that didn't stop the American government from finding a loophole in the form of the Gary Act. The Gary Act was essentially an extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act, but with added restrictions. These restrictions included the registration of each Chinese immigrant living in the United States. If there was no proof of residency for an individual, they would be immediately deported. Also, Congress put into play quotas and requirements for a certain number of immigrants based on their natural origin. The Gary Act allowed the regulation of Chinese immigration all the way until the 1920s. Unfortunately, if there was ever an immigrant who tried to fight the injustice of this act, it was shut down promptly by the government. The Chi-Cheng-Ping versus United States, also known as the Chinese Exclusion Supreme Court case, proves this.
The Chi-Cheng-Ping versus United States was a well-known example of the Chinese inability to stand up against the government. The case involved the unlawful detainment of Ping by Captain Walker on a writ of habeas corpus in San Francisco, California. Ping was a Chinese laborer who worked on a steamship called the Gaelic. Possessing the correct certification, Ping sailed for Hong Kong to do business. Upon his return, he presented the appropriate documents to the collector of the port, but was denied entry to the country. Unbeknownst to Ping, during his travels, the certificates Ping possessed to regain access to the country was revised, turning his documents null and void, forcing him to be detained by Captain Walker on the steamship. Ping petitioned to the Circuit of the United States that he was unlawfully restrained of his liberty and requested Walker be punished for his unconstitutional acts. However, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Walker. The message was clear. The Chinese Exclusion Act has the power of Congress behind it and to uphold it, and any Chinese immigrants who threaten that would be collateral damage.
But you see this sort of ebb and flow of what we call nativism at periodic times in American history where Americans, and it's usually due to economic reasons, but there's also, religious and cultural reasons, or just simply fear that we're being overrun by foreigners who are, as I said earlier, not like us. They're not, they're maybe not Christian. They might have darker skin. They might come from areas of the world that we're unfamiliar with, and it's simply then they become easy targets for either harassment if they're here, or simply the closing of the door to them based on fear and ethnocentrism and outright racism, racial animosity.
Eventually, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. Congress repealed any and all natural origin restrictions through the Immigration Act of 1965. On July 1, 1968, 170,000 immigrants were allowed to enter the United States, which allowed a wide, flexible net of families, employment, and diversity visas, with only the restriction of 20,000 immigrating from a single country. The Immigration Act of 1965 was the most all-inclusive immigration law that has been passed to date. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a very controversial, hypocritical, and racial piece of legislation that opened the door to themes we see today in present immigration laws. To bar an entire nation of people from entering the United States is not what a nation of immigrants should stand for. Everyone would do well to remember that America is a melting pot full of cultures who welcomes all looking for a fresh start at life.